I'm very much I'm very much involved in a down-to-earth practical analysis of our national and regional societal, socioeconomic, and political realities, as I'm running basically an institute which is mainly dedicated to policy research, or as we are registered in the technical sense of the word, applied and experimental social and research in the humanities. So the point here being is that I deal with policy, amongst other things, policy issues that are interlinked with matters of cultural conflict. I have conducted a number of studies trying to understand, explicate basically the cultural policy, especially during the uh, during the period when VMRO and Nikola Gruevski were in power in Macedonia. So the role of cultural policy in nation building, in building of a national narrative. So hence I'm here, and hence the topic I'll be talking on, and hence, or linked to this prior policy, mainly studies research, as I said, linked to cultural policy and the narrative of, national identity that has been built in the last couple of decades in the country. I have found myself very active in the period that preceded the Prespa agreement with Greece, very active among other intellectuals from the country and from across the border, so in Greece, around creating a climate where expert public intellectuals, activists could find themselves in good faith conversation, and a conversation that does not shy away from the awkward issues, uncomfortable issues, sensitive issues linked to identity politics on both sides, in particular cultural identities, taking into consideration that concerns around one's national historiography is a matter of self-cultural profiling, and it is cultural heritage as well, and is invested in the national narrative. So all of us who were interested in having an honest conversation on these issues on the both sides of the border between Greece and then Macedonia, we provided, I would say, or foregrounded a certain discourse that we like to believe helped the two governments reach an agreement. I would say that some of the contours of the solutions that we find in the Prespa agreement, like the Article 7, which kind of allows the two sides to have their own alternative use of the term Macedonian, was in a way hinted by the exchanges of all of us, the intellectuals from across the borders, that were pretty active, maybe for a whole period of an entire year, perhaps, of writing opus in Athens and here, having events, exchanges, giving interviews here and there. I would say more there. We were more active in Athens than in Skopje. And I believe that, you know, these discussions somehow influenced perhaps the imagination of the politicians to come up with solutions, because we did not only discuss abstract matters of identity. We, even though most of us were academics, we did not discuss these issues in abstract or scholarly academic manner, but rather in terms of, again, cultural policy, then international policy, then European policy of enlargement, etc. So in such terms that our discussions would be accessible to the policymakers, to the wider public, but also for the sake of the quality of our own contribution to solving the problem, because we were all aware that unless we talk in terms of policy and, you know, what move should be done, taken in order to achieve a certain outcome, there wouldn't have been discussions or ideas, I would say, that could solve the problem. And we like to believe that we helped with these ideas that were framed, as I said, in specific policy terms. To we helped to the elites to come up with some sort of solutions. Once again, now North Macedonia is facing cultural heritage, history related, cultural conflict basically issue at the heart of its stalled integration process. Obviously, we have many cultural issues and issues with our national narrative. I don't know if those are our issues or the issues of the neighbors having issues with us, or we all share those issues. It's a debatable issue, this quandary itself. Of course, I mean, I do not intend to present North Macedonia as the perpetual victim. I don't believe that, you know, rhetoric or reasoning of victimization leads to any positive outcome. So I'm not going to discuss the question in that matter and manner, and I will approach it more closely soon. I just want to give more details to this current, or I would say like constant context of Macedonia's frustration as a 16 years long EU candidate country. As a country of 16 years long candidacy, which is quite a rare case. I'm certain it's you know, comparable to Turkey, I guess, but Turkey is a different story. I think that their efforts to join are not as eager as ours, I would say. And Turkey is a different country. It's you know, powerful, rich country, so it's the two narratives are not comparable. Plus, our context here is the so-called Western Balkans. So in that respect, yes, in the respect of the region in question, indeed, we are a very specific case. And to the length of our candidacy and the length of, you know, constantly frustrated attempts to join the union, we should add the specificity that each veto, I'm not saying that the reform process has always been perfect, but the vetoes from Greece and from Bulgaria have always been linked to this cultural conflict between us and them in both of the cases. So this is the other specificity. Indeed, it's the argument that we are not ready, the argument of the French president from 2 years ago that the reforms here are purely formal, but substantially they are not quite there yet, may hold, but that thing, that kind of a commitment may hold for so many countries, including member states. So I wouldn't take it as a very convincing argument, even though he might be right, and he probably is right, but I doubt that's the main reason. Suddenly, everybody becomes aware of the fact that, oh, it's not just about the form now. It's finally, when Macedonia comes next in line, it's a matter of substance, not just form. Whereas the form was more or less sufficient, obviously, for all the others. So there is okay, talking about the form and both the substance regarding reform processes, etc., let's not forget that we were invited to submit an application for candidacy even before Croatia, right after Slovenia, a few months before Croatia. So it's been a really long time, and obviously back then we kind of fulfilled certain criteria to get the invitation. I had to make this remark concerning reform, the so-called Europeanization of the country, etc., etc. When I'll come to the issue of Bulgaria at the end, I want to tackle the entire perspective of the Union of the Balkans, of its integration, this vision of the reform process, and taken into consideration this. Again, I would approach this glance view from the West on the Balkans from the cultural point of view. So taking into consideration this glance that's, I would say, too austere, if not severe, or toward the Balkans, or unfair. I would say that it does not help the Balkans improve the state of affairs, especially in terms of rule of law in any of these countries. Quite to the contrary, I think that it helps to deteriorate the situation. And ironically, it further Balkanizes the Balkans, I would say. I'm sure that the Western elites would disagree. I'm sure that this does not sound like a Eurocentric discourse, what I just remarked, but I assure you, I'm a huge advocate of unified Europe. Maybe that's why my frustration is actually big, or bigger than that of others. I'm a huge advocate of this European co-belonging, and that's why maybe my judgment is harsh, and therefore I accuse the West in this case, or the leading EU countries, or the old Europe as they call it, even though the old one, historically speaking, is right here in the Balkans. And from the standpoint of the history of the civilization. But let's call the current old Europe the old Europe. So I'm accusing this old Europe of this austere, and I would say austere, slightly unfair, balkanizing glance on the Balkans that renders the situation, in spite of their best wishes, I would say worse. And I'll explain why. I come from a country that once used to be part of a federation called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia fell apart through wars. So an anomy had to occur. So these were ruins of a previously existing country and a functional system. Out of these ruins and anomy, we were supposed to build countries that were fully functional systems of rule of law. Isn't this cynical? I'm sorry. Isn't this cynical? The idea that these are cultures that do not have sense of rule of law is orientalizing in Edward Said's sense, so not in a good sense. There is a touch of, cultural racism, I would say there. This perspective, the perspective that we are innately unable to introduce and respect rule of law. All of us, the cultures of the so-called Balkans, now the so-called Western Balkans. It took me time to understand what Western Balkans was supposed to mean. And why is it called Western? So I realized, I think that Balkans is an insulting word, so that they added Western there not to insult us further. So anyway, this perspective was interiorized by our societies. We see ourselves as Balkan or Balkanized countries, unable to establish rule of law. We have been learning for decades, and here we are, we have learned nothing. Yes, but we could not keep up because we were not really states until the end of the 90s. We came out of war, out of a completely different system. So we were building countries from scratch, and somebody expects these countries built from scratch to be fully functional, totally European level, even though poor systems of rule of law. And so there is something inherently wrong with our cultures, and our culture is of course called Balkan because we are inherently incapable of exacting rule of law. So there you have another cultural policy that affects, I would say, the way Europe views this region, the way we have interiorized this European gaze upon the Balkans, and that demeaning, let's say, attitude that we have interiorized does not really help improve our countries, because it undermines the faith in the societies and cultures to build proper functioning systems. So amidst all of this, the enlargement process is stalled. It's stalled or is in a deadlock because of all of this that I just explained. I really have serious reservations that it's just Bulgaria stalling the process. I think that all sorts of, I don't know, excuses or to be inactive around the enlargement process could be found on the part of the so-called old Europe, not to engage further with these problematic countries. I'm not problematic in scare marks, scare signs. I'm not saying that Europe is duplicitous and that it does not say what it really wants, and what it really wants is us outside the Union. That's not what I'm saying. Um, all I'm saying is that, you know, it feels comfortable to delay the unpleasant change that the integration of the region might cause to, you know, the comfortable situation the Union is right now currently. So, you know, like, every new member and, you know, change of the entire structure of the scene is kind of situation of, you know, sometimes there is such thing as positive stress. So even if we're welcome, it's a positive stress. So one seeks to delay the thing, especially if one does not recognize the need of such a change. I do think that Europe is still slave to its old technocratic reason from its inception, from the 90s on, and it fails to adopt a more realist political vision according to which territories, control of territories, of land matters. And now, in the midst of the Union, you have these patches of undefined territory that's in a process of integration, but not quite integrated, which are, in fact, potentially destabilizing for Europe. But I think that because of this cultural racism I talked about of the developed parts of Europe, because of our interiorization of this glance, gaze of stereotypes, etc., we all jointly fail to see that, you know, huge things are at stake, especially in the current global political scene, and that Europe cannot afford to be too comfortable with lands and territories amidst of its so the Union itself, amidst of it, or with, yeah, amidst of its territory within its borders, to be left in such an undefined situation. It must have a proactive and, I would say, a more decisive treatment of its own territory in terms of, you know, continent's territory, not in terms of breaching the rights of sovereign states, of course. That's why I used proactive, not offensive or you know, anything harsher than that attitude towards this lands, these countries, albeit while respecting their sovereignty, that's for sure. But we do not see anything like that. It's still like a competition for an award where, you know, the outsiders compete to join the Union, instead of having the other situation where the big players basically reach out to the smaller players and say, like, here are your perks, join the Union, because the big players have more stakes and more to lose if you know, the continent itself is not under their control. You know, we are not in the 90s anymore, and we do not believe the myths of deterritorialized, you know, purely, I don't know, in terms of, you know, virtual or other presence, loose networks of connections, etc., etc. In these centuries, especially after the rise of, you know, 10 years of strong populism in Europe, we are aware that geopolitics, you know, territory matters. So I cannot grasp the fact that the big players of Europe do not reason in this realist terms yet. And to conclude, going back to the Macedonian-Bulgarian cultural conflict one more time, when I discuss with our elites here, I always criticize our side, because I think that, you know, self-infantilization, asking Europe to abide to its principles, pointing to the obvious fact that the bigger brother is, you know, being unfair to the smaller brothers, which is North Macedonia, etc. That's all a non-strategy. That's not taking your fate in your own hands and do something about it. So that's why I always criticize our side when they say, our government, our elites, when they say, well, it's we can't do anything about it because we cannot, you know, forgo our identity or language. Therefore, we'll just patiently wait until Europe does something. So, you know, the big players in Europe. That's self-infantilization, and that's never going to happen. Then there is another, again, passive-aggressive or just passive rhetoric, like, you know, it's unfair what Bulgaria is doing. We're not going to allow that. We feel insulted, therefore we do not talk. You have to talk, even though if the very subject of a conversation is unfair, you have to talk. You have no other choice. So you must come up with a solution. But for that, you need imagination, political imagination, diplomatic imagination, and intellectual imagination. So academics, experts who can come up with solutions and formulations of solutions that can accommodate such delicate conflicts as cultural conflicts between two competing national myths or narratives are. So you have to do something like that, something in that direction, even though the very situation you're put in is unfair, but you are in it, so you ought to do something about it. So that's why I do criticize our side for its current approach to the matter. It's not my thing to criticize the Bulgarian side, because I don't want to be the nationalist here and to defend my own side only. I think that by all of the criticism I poured toward the European Union, I indirectly said what I wanted to say about Bulgaria's treatment. And I see it as an aspect of the overall treatment of the union. So that's why I don't want to single them out, and I don't want, not only because I do not want to sound like a nationalist, but because I think the responsibility is bigger than that of Bulgaria only. Certainly, it's but I don't want to sound like a hypocrite either, so I must say that issues such as how one formulates one's own national narrative, or how one calls their language, is an indecent, politically speaking, an indecent conversation. No one should permit themselves to have that sort of conversations, to tell the other side what the language is called, or refuse to use it, as the Portuguese proposal of the Portuguese presidency suggested. They conceded basically to this Bulgarian demand, and allowed for a bilateral address toward North Macedonia and its language, for Bulgaria to use the term, the official language of the country, without using the term Macedonian. Macedonian is, in international linguistics and the UN Charter of Languages, is a recognized standardized South Slavic language that exists. So for your neighbor to refuse to call your language by its name is disrespectful. So even if it doesn't harm us, it's disrespectful. And this is, even if we agree to this proposal, and it seems like we kind of agreed, but that's not sufficient for Bulgaria. We may solve the problem and de-block the enlargement process, and overcome the situation we're in, but it will be a toxic relationship, a good neighborly yet toxic relationship, because your neighbor refuses to call your language as it's called. I mean, if that is the case, the problem is that, unlike the situation with Greece, when the intellectuals could follow more closely what's being discussed and kind of contribute to the discussion through OPES, as I said, conferences, workshops we organize, etc. This time it's not so clear, and there is no such direct, actually not at all, an active communication with the academic, not just civil society in the widest possible sense of the word. So academia, both academia and civil society proper, like NGOs, etc., expert groups and similar. So I don't see that conversation taking place currently. So we are not sure if Bulgaria indeed refuses to call the language as it's called. We're not sure if that's the situation, but if that's the case, that's really unacceptable. And I think that unless we do basically replicate the model that we created quite spontaneously around Prespa agreement with Greece, of intellectuals on both sides creating a discourse of trust, of breaking taboos, of saying the uncomfortable things, naming things with, because unlike the politicians, they have the luxury of naming things with their real name, even though insulting, even though awkward, and not and then I think one does not feel comfortable uttering. Still, the intellectuals should play that role, or let's say the civil society. When I say the civil society, as I said, I mean both academics, and I mean because in the widest possible sense, civil society means also academia. So both academics and experts, NGOs, civil society in the narrow sense of the word, they are the ones that can permit themselves to be less diplomatic and you know, say the unpleasant things in order to face the reality, and by speaking in honesty and good faith with one another, create bridges that bring about discourse that can maybe help the politicians reach difficult decisions. We have tried something like that from the both sides of the border. I myself have been uh, part of an initiative with colleagues from Bulgaria. We signed a letter on November 2nd, addressed to both governments to leave history, historiography, and linguistics out of the uh, political negotiations, because it's simply not their place to deal with these issues. That's how it's supposed to be done. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but the committee is in session around Prespa agreement with Greece, and nobody's making a big fuss as to how far advanced those historical committees are, or committees concerning educational reforms or similar. It's just the background activity going on in the background of the processes. You know, the agreement itself was enough for Greece to lift the veto. So we basically asked the same thing with this letter that we initiated and signed with our a few people from here and a few people from Bulgaria. We signed this letter, and it gained asking these things as that I just explained, and we did gain a lot of visibility, especially in Bulgaria. We were called traitors on both sides. So the Macedonians were called traitors here in most of the media, and the public, especially in the social media, but were somehow liked in Bulgaria, and the other way around. Those from the Bulgaria side that signed that letter were perceived by our media and public as, you know, good guys from the other side, but were called Soros paid traitors in Bulgaria. So we all got the same treatment on both of our sides. But that's the price that the intellectuals must and the civil society must pay in order to help in processes like this. And we were ready to pay it, and we were ready to continue doing things like that. Uh, but unfortunately, we noticed that unlike the responsiveness of, you know, the Greek and the Macedonian government back then, but in particular the Greek government back then around Prespa agreement, maybe because many of the intellectuals that were part of that process were close to Syriza, and maybe because Syriza is a progressive party, I don't know, that might have helped. But currently, our efforts that were done on purely voluntary basis, that continued not only around this letter, but also by helping one another to give interviews in Bulgaria and the other way around, write op-eds, etc., all done on purely voluntary basis and spontaneous basis, has been somehow ignored by the both governments, and interestingly enough, ignored by the international community here. There was no one, you know, to offer some support, help, so that this process gains visibility and some kind of endorsement. And I'm not talking just about finances. I'm talking about a certain endorsement. If the international community pays attention to these efforts and supports them, then it gains on, you know, visibility, respectability, and becomes a certain societal power that pushes things forth, or something that they have to, count with, the two governments. Well, this effort kind of stays on the margins, even though we kept on, carrying them out. So I think that that's what we can do in more specifically regarding the issue with Bulgaria. We should stop complaining and reminding Europe that it's not abiding to its principles, and assume an active role in order to solve our issues with the integration process. In the case of Bulgaria, with Bulgaria as well, such an empowered position can be achieved only if we really move away from this interiorized prejudice toward ourselves, that we're somehow inherently incapable of being proper countries, regardless of what the system was once when we were Yugoslavia, and regardless of what one thinks of it ideologically, it was a system, and there was a very solid respect for the rule of law. So there is nothing inherently culturally wrong with us that demands some kind of re-education in order to be proper Europeans. We had been through a lot in terms of, social, political, economic upheavals of, a very traumatic sort, and that lasted at least for a decade, and a prolonged decade, I would say, way into the beginning of the 21st century. After all, Macedonia had its little war, as I call it. No war is little, but compared to what happened in the rest of Yugoslavia, it was of small scale and didn't last long. In 2001, so it was, a tectonic, traumatic period for more than a decade. And then, around 2010, they tell you, well, you're, just Balkans, inherently incapable, but working on your Europeanization. I think that, that's that gaze upon ourselves should not be interiorized. We should see ourselves as active political agents, and, work on building proper institutions, etc., without the naivety that we can do it as fully sovereign, independent states without any heed of the union. No, in one way or another, we are linked with this union, and we must build and strengthen, build good relations, deepen those relations, strengthen those relations, insist on, perhaps this is the positive side of Macron's veto, the sectoral reform. I think that that's actually a fantastic thing, because it enables you to integrate, as he would put it, substantially or in a substantive way, by transforming sectors of your society and being de facto like the European Union, without the political power of a state to decide on it, which is fine for our societies. And that's the positive effect of that veto, I would say. So it's something we should seize and work on, and try to benefit from this sectoral improvements, rather than, and integration, rather than insisting on, adopting the chapters. So in order to have this emancipated yet pro-European, deeply committed European stance, we need to empower our position, empower our self-perception, and see ourselves as the active agents of, the processes and contribute to the solutions of the problems we find ourselves in. So, sorry, I went over time and I was too extensive, maybe. I hope I did not bore you.
No, it was really a very interesting lecture. So thank you, Mr. Kolozova.
Thanks.
Now is the time for audience questions and comments. If you want to join the conversation, feel free to turn on your microphone or camera, or just write your questions in the chat so we will read them. Maybe first question, a little bit off topic now. What is the situation with the coronavirus and restrictions in Northern Macedonia now?
Well, currently, the almost no restrictions. I mean, you have these restrictions in the restaurants, etc. How many people sit at the table, etc. Limitations of groups in the closed spaces, and similar. Wearing masks in certain places, but not outside anymore in the streets, as it was until a month ago, or more than a month ago. Now the numbers are good. The infections are dropping. I don't know what's the rate of the vaccination process, but I think that Serbia helped a lot, and Bulgaria is, by the way, also offering vaccination for Macedonian citizens. So the neighbors are helping, and so there is no quite clear, precise picture of what's the rate of vaccination, but I think it's pretty decent, especially with the help of the neighbors. So here is one positive example of Balkan collaboration. I can just say that practically all of my colleagues, except one at the Institute, are currently vaccinated. So, and until a month ago, we weren't. So I'm guessing things are moving in a good direction in that respect.
It is really good to hear that. So we have one question from Mr. Etienne Penny. Dear Professor, thank you for your presentation. You spoke about Edward Said. Do you think his concept of Orientalism could describe as well the European Western countries' view about the Balkan countries?
Yeah, there is this book by Maria Todorova, Imagining the Balkans, where she's Bulgarian, by the way, by origin, but teaches in the States. Let me write it down. Imagining the Balkans. So she kind of appropriates Said's notion of orientalization and adjusts it to the concept of Balkanization. And imagining the Balkans, as her book is titled, it's an adaptation of Said's notion of orientalization. Yes, that's how I used the term. You're right, except I referred to Said instead of Todorova because I imagined that would be sounding more familiar to the audience than speak of Balkanization in the sense of Maria Todorova's book. But it was quite popular like a decade, maybe more than a decade ago. There is an entire issue, and oh God, I'll have to remember that I have an article there, and it's a famous journal. It's Psychoanalysis, Culture, and something. I'll remember. I have an article there. It was edited by Dusan Bielic. It was precisely on Todorova's notion of Balkanization as coined in line with Edward Said's concept of orientalization. So yes, I'll send you the reference further if you wish. Let me just find it.
Thank you for your answer. So do we have any other questions? This is a short comment from Etienne again. Could this balkanization analyze, oh, wait a second, there is another one. Could this balkanization analyzed by Todorova become an obstacle to their European integration?
Well, she's talking about the glance of the West. So it's not balkanization like the verb in English, but quite to the opposite. It's just an analog to Said's notion of orientalization. So this is the Western gaze, that this on the other, not how the other is constituted. I think that this gaze of balkanization has been already elevated to a problem to the integration processes. That's why I spoke of it at the beginning. I think that there is this genuine prejudice toward, these cultures as, inherently prone to anomy and chaos, etc., etc. Uncivilized Balkans, without actually taking into account simple facts of I spoke of at the beginning, that obviously point out to other factors that led to the situation we are in currently and have nothing to do with being inherently like this or like that. But I do believe that, as you're mentioning, that this balkanizing as per Todorova per se gaze of the West has been already an obstacle to the integration processes and has given rise to Euroscepticism in the old Europe. I think so, yes.
Thank you. There's another question from Mr. Domagoj Fuk. Very interesting presentation. My question is there a possibility that Bulgaria relinquishes its claims on historic events regarding the Ilinden uprising and VMRO, since it claims the uprising as well as North Macedonia does?
I doubt that. I doubt that, and I don't think that should be done. This is a history that we studied in Yugoslavia. So there so many things that now come to the surface, and seems that Bulgarians are right to some degree, at least as far as certain facts are concerned. Obviously, at the period of this Ilinden uprising, there was kind of, let's say, a complex sense of identity. So there was this Macedonian sense of identity in emergence on the background of a declared sense of Bulgarian identity. So it was at least a dual sense of identity back then for many of them. I'm not saying for many of the heroes around this uprising. I'm not saying all of them, but many of them. So it's really not so black and white. And as we used to believe, based on the things we studied in Yugoslavia, to some extent they do have right to protest around certain narratives, but that thing is irrelevant. These conversations should not be part of accession process discussions. I mean, details around uprisings that happened more than 100 years ago, and whether these heroes identified as this or that, Bulgarian, Macedonian, or both, it doesn't matter which historiography is right. It should be a question of historiography or history. It shouldn't be a political question. What states ought or not recognize is the current reality of nation states and their official languages is a political act, and that political act is grounded in the respect to of the right to self-determination, and that should be enough. I think that both Bulgaria and Macedonia should limit to just this act of mutual recognition, and that's both the minimum and the maximum they can do. Everything else is bad taste. Even Greece, even though it was concerned about its history and Alexander the Great, etc., as soon as they solved it in political terminology, which is what the Prespa agreement is comprised of, they just left the history to the expert teams and stopped talking about it. And it should be done in a similar way. Just recognize or respect the current reality and leave the commissions do their job. That shouldn't be part of a political process. How can a parliament take a declaration on issues concerning history or languages? I mean, it's a really, well, that's a non-European thing. I mean, you have politicians deciding what's a political truth, even if the narrative that they endorse about a historical truth, I'm sorry, that they endorse, for example, that such and such was the history of Macedonia and Bulgaria, I don't know, 50, 70 years ago, even if they were completely right, or at least even if I completely agreed with them, we would still have the problem of a parliament, therefore politicians, deciding what's historically true. Can you imagine that in France or Germany, where the Bundestag says, okay, this is the history of Germany and this is the truth, the rest is a lie? That's unimaginable. That's complete breach of academic freedom. This kind of decency of the political conversation must be resumed from both sides, especially on the side of Bulgaria, and we should stick to this. And this goes also for Macedonia. If Bulgaria says, okay, this nation and its language, as it is called currently, is recognized by us, the question of history is such and such, and our position is such and such, and for example, we're insulted with that, or we disagree with that, we also, so now the Macedonian side, should be aware that this is a discussion that belongs to the experts in the area, and the politicians should be satisfied with the fact that the current state of affairs is recognized, and leave the conversation about history, even though insulting, to the historians. So I see this as the only model of solution. Simply entering into or venturing to create a political discourse that will solve the issue by toxifying it with historiography on both sides, so including our side, even though reactive, is doomed to fail, according to me.
Thank you for your answer.
Do we have? Yeah, that's what. Yeah.
Do we have maybe any other questions? So I believe that we come to an end with our first lecture. I would like to thank you once again for participating in our conference. It was a very interesting lecture, I must say.
Thanks.
And unfortunately, as I said earlier, Mr. Banulovic from Serbia can't hold his lecture today due to unexpected circumstances. So we're going to have a 1 hour break now. We will start our second lecture at 3 p.m. You can all stay connected to our Zoom meeting. So thank you once again and see you in 1 hour.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you. So I believe we can start now with our last lecture in the conference, and it will be the presentation by Mr. Demo Šaša, Director of the European Policy Institute of Kosovo. First of all, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Many thanks for the invitation and for having me. It is Friday. It is the last day of the week, and I am the last presentation of the event. So I will try to be brief. So basically, the topic is European integration process of Kosovo. So let me try and present the state of play of the European integration process of Kosovo through three different stages of these last 20 years. So if we would look into the European integration process of Kosovo for these last 20 years, since the war has ended, you would see three different stages. So first stage was the one which started after the war and lasted up until 2008. So during this first stage of relationships between Kosovo and European Union, it was largely cooperation based on the general UN mandate that stemmed from the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244, that in Kosovo there should be an international administration, and within that international administration, European Union had a very significant role. So if you would go back in that time period, 1999, 2008, you would see that European Union was main international actor that was helping Kosovo institutions to basically put the basic building blocks in this overall effort of creating a democratic society, so a liberal democracy with independent institutions, with independent branches of government. So it was an effort to establish basic elements of competitive market economy. So in principle, it was initially a humanitarian, but then more structural assistance, both political and financial one, to establish basic functions of let's call it self-governance. So that was the first stage of our relationship. It wasn't more than that. It was political. It was not a formal, legal, contractual relationship. It was simply a political, humanitarian cooperation under the auspices of the United Nations. Then we come to 2008, and the second stage of our relationship begins. This second stage of our relationship started from 2008 until 2016. Now, this is a stage where Kosovo has proclaimed independence. Kosovo started a dialogue with the European Union in terms of requesting that Kosovo starts being treated as other regional countries in Number one, establishing contractual relationship with the European Union, just like other Western Balkan countries have done. And secondly, asking for a clear path towards the accession. So, with this in mind, the goal was to move from a political relationship. So, after the proclamation of independence, to move from a political relationship into a more contractual relationship between Kosovo and the European Union. In this light, we in 2008, so Kosovo in 2008 was already behind other regional countries in the European integration process. So what was behind? What was Kosovo behind? It was behind, number one, we didn't have, like other countries had, a stabilization and association agreement. So having a stabilization and association agreement is your first step towards accession to the European Union. So we didn't have that. Number two, we didn't start a visa liberalization process. So we were behind other regional countries, so we were asking to start a visa liberalization process. Immediately at the outset of this, let's call it a political dialogue that started immediately after the proclamation of independence, the European Union made it clear. They made it clear that one of the key conditions for Kosovo in order to advance towards the European Union is dialogue with Serbia. So that was made abundantly clear. So no matter whether we will be discussing SAA, no matter whether we will be discussing visa liberalization, progress in the dialogue with Serbia was one of the key, well, not one of the key, it was the key requirement. Successfully, we started the dialogue for normalization of relationships with Serbia. So after the United Nations General Assembly resolution of 2010 that asked Kosovo and Serbia to start a dialogue on normalization of relationships, the European Union became a mediator of the dialogue, and quite quickly, basically in 2011-12, we reached a series of very important political agreements. Like, for example, by 2011, because of extremely different views on the Kosovo independence that Kosovo and Serbia had, basically until 2011, Kosovo and Serbia didn't sit within different regional European international meetings. So they refused to be seated at the table at all of these different international regional meetings. In most cases, Kosovo couldn't even sit at these meetings because Serbia would always object. Whether in cases where Kosovo could sit, it would be seated under the United Nations Security Council decision 1244, which was unacceptable to Kosovo. So, in that light, one of the agreements that Kosovo and Serbia reached was agreement on regional cooperation and regional representation. So, for the first time, Kosovo and Serbia agreed a formula through which they will participate at different regional European international meetings. Now, this agreement opened the path for Kosovo to become a member of regional and international organizations and to be seated at all these regional international forums. after that agreement in 2011, Kosovo started negotiations with the European Union on the stabilization and association agreement. So this was extremely important for Kosovo because for the first time, Kosovo and the European Union would have legal, contractual relationships. So there was now a legal, contractual future, guaranteed future for Kosovo within the European Union. So during 2013 and 14, we negotiated the SAA, and on the 1st of April 2016, SAA came into force, and since then, Kosovo and European Union enjoy contractual relationship, and now our next step is application for the candidate status for the accession to the Union. So this was our first major success on our path towards the European Union. The second development during this second stage of the Kosovo European integration process was the launch of visa liberalization. So Kosovo was the last country to start visa liberalization dialogue with the European Union. So in 2012, if I'm not wrong, we started the visa liberalization dialogue. And by 2016, so within 4 years, we implemented all visa liberalization criteria. Since 2016, we are basically in this deadlock between ourselves and the European Union, where we can't find a way to deliver visa liberalization for Kosovo because of many different dynamics. So on one side, Kosovo, despite the fact that it has met all visa liberalization criteria in 2016, Kosovo was requested, let's say, one last thing in 2016, and that was demarcation of border between Kosovo and Montenegro. And back in 2016, it was proposed that 3 countries benefit from visa liberalization: Georgia, Ukraine, and Kosovo. And unfortunately, we missed that momentum in 2016 because our political parties failed to ratify demarcation agreement with Montenegro in 2016. Thus we lagged behind Georgia and Ukraine, who proceeded further, got visa liberalization, whereas Kosovo didn't. We did eventually ratify demarcation agreement with Montenegro in 2018, but by then it was too late. By then, internal dynamics within the European Union had changed. So Brexit was happening, rise of extreme right all over the European Union. If you recall, a very significant migration wave was seen within the European Union. So the appetite for opening borders was not really there anymore. Anyhow, very, very complex dynamics of development that unfortunately rendered the situation where Kosovo still doesn't enjoy visa liberalization, and we believe that in the next few months it will happen. So this is our second major development within Kosovo European integration process. So first was achievement of the Stabilization Association Agreement. The second was visa liberalization dialogue and eventual implementation of all criteria, and now hopefully conclusion of the visa liberalization dialogue. So that's the second stage of our European integration process. So our second stage, while first stage was 1999, 2008, second stage is 2008 and until basically pretty much today. Now, the third stage of Kosovo-European integration process, I would argue it has just started. Has just started in a sense that we have been in a deadlock on moving forward in our EU integration path almost exclusively because of Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. So for the last 3 years, there was literally no progress. There was literally no progress in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. And as there was no progress in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, simultaneously, there has been no progress on the Kosovo EU integration path. So we have today came to the point where we all accept and realize that there can't be further progress towards the European Union without a significant progress in our normalization of relations between Kosovo and Serbia. So practically what that means is that without a significant progress in the Kosovo-Serbia relations, we can't expect that there will be a serious discussion about our candidate status for the accession to the Union. Without a serious progress in the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia, there can't be end of the visa liberalization process. Therefore, we recognize that there must be progress in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue relations in order for us to advance further in this third stage of relationships between Kosovo and Serbia. We live in very special times, very unique times in Kosovo, because for the first time since ever, we have a governing majority that is capable comfortably to have a full government mandate. So we have one political party that has won more than 50, so more than 50% of the votes. This has put the governing party in extremely comfortable position to push forward on many, many fronts. Is it number one, dialogue with Serbia? Is it number two, much needed, publicly required reforms on rule of law, on fight against corruption, on fight against organized crime? So we now live in a unique situation where current biggest political party and governing political party can comfortably deliver on much needed reforms that we have been waiting for a very long while. So we hope that this new political momentum will be a breakthrough. Number one, in our Kosovo-Serbia relationship, and number two, on internal reform agenda, which combined will open a new stage of Kosovo-EU relationship, with Kosovo getting the candidate status and in few years open accession talks with the European Union. So these are three stages. These are three stages that we have seen in these 20 years of Kosovo-EU relationship. Kosovo is basically is the last country in the region when it comes to European integration. So basically, only ourselves and Bosnia do not enjoy candidate status for the accession to the EU. So we are kind of, if you will, we are laggers. We are laggers of the European integration process of Western Balkans. So we hope that the new government will now provide new impetus to the process and bring us closer to the EU, both in terms of concluding a much needed visa liberalization process, and number two, bringing us closer to the candidate status and eventually opening of accession talks. So this is in a nutshell. The Kosovo European integration process. I'll stop here. And then maybe we can exchange on different aspects of the Kosovo European integration process. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. Now it's the time. If someone wants to ask question, feel free to turn on your microphone camera or just write your question in chat. So maybe for start a little off topic, can you please tell us the situation with coronavirus and restrictions now in Kosovo? What is the situation? Is it going better or?
Yeah, so situation is currently, it appears to be a good one, in a sense that we have minimum cases of persons that are infected with the virus. There are rare cases of losses of life. So we might have one loss of life during the week, whereas a number of cases that turned positive in terms of being infected with the virus doesn't go above 10 cases, 10 people per day. So it seems that it's better than what it was, but we are all also very nervous. We are all also very nervous following developments of this new variant of the virus, Delta virus, that we are seeing a rise across Europe, and a virus that seems more contagious. We are nervous, and we hope for the best. Vaccination has started, massive vaccination has started, but it's going at slow pace. So by now we have vaccinated, if I'm not wrong, maybe just like 2% of population. So it just started, but it's not going to at the speed that we wished. So yeah, a degree of normality, but followed with the blanket of nervousness, nervousness of what's ahead of us.
Yeah, so we can only hope for the best then. Let's see if we have some questions. I do not see that we have any questions for now. So, oh, there is one. From Mr. Etienne Penny, what are the main current obstacles to the continuation of the dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia?
Well, there are two main obstacles. Number one, let's talk first about the external one. So, in my view, first obstacle is the lack of US clear political, not clear, strong, the lack of strong political interest of the US to resolve Kosovo-Serbia open issues. So we are not seeing, yes, United States are involved, yes, United States are there, they clearly are communicating the importance of the dialogue. Even President Biden sent a letter to our Prime Minister underlying the importance of the dialogue. But beyond these formalities of letters, of diplomats repeating the same messages, we are not seeing a genuine, strong political interest at the White House, that could deliver on the Kosovo Serbia dialogue. So that is something we are not seeing for the moment. So that's first external obstacle. A second external obstacle is the lack of EU's political cohesion and political will to offer significant carrots to Kosovo and to Serbia if they reach a deal. So EU cannot for the moment, because of political reasons, EU cannot for the moment say, look, if these two countries reach a deal, we will consider an accession date for these two countries. So just to take as an extreme case. So the fact that EU is currently faced with many internal challenges is weakening EU's external capacity to deliver on issues such as Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. So those two I would identify as external obstacles. Internally, between Kosovo and Serbia, to be honest, I see a bigger obstacle on Serbia's side. Why? Because if I would look at Kosovo side, it is for me very clear what Kosovo can gain. What Kosovo can gain from a potential Kosovo-Serbia deal, right? So Kosovo will gain recognition by Serbia. It will gain potential accession at the United Nations, accession at NATO, candidate status country in accession to the European Union, accession at the Council of Europe, visa liberalization, recognition by 5 member states of the European Union who do not currently recognize Kosovo. So there are a number of clear benefits for Kosovo if Kosovo and Serbia reach a deal. When I look now at Serbia's side, I can't see what are those carrots, what are those benefits that Serbia will receive in a case. So I can't see their incentive, except a very genuine reason, that is that Serbia accepts the reality, accepts the fact that Kosovo has proclaimed independence, and International Court of Justice has confirmed that proclamation of independence of Kosovo was not done in the violation of international law. So, except of this genuine fact that Serbia simply accepts the reality that Kosovo is an independent country, I can't see what are the benefits for Serbia to reach a deal. So that's first internal obstacle. Second internal obstacle is now more on Kosovo side, not on Serbia side, and it is linked to the fact that the current political party who has won 50% of the votes in the last election, who is currently a governing party. So they have had a very anti-dialogue with Serbia discourse while they were in the opposition. So for them now, with the history of such a strong anti-dialogue with Serbia discourse, it is difficult to see how will they now move from such an extreme, strong anti-Serbia dialogue position to a more normal, let's call it, position where they are ready to engage in the dialogue, reach an agreement, and improve relations with Serbia. So internally in Kosovo, government now needs to do a bit of public communication efforts in order to explain to the public this shift between being extremely anti-dialogue with Serbia political party into now a more responsible state building, political party that is in the government and recognizes the importance of the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. So these would be, let's say, two reasons of external nature that are obstacles to dialogue, and two obstacles that are of internal nature in Serbia and Kosovo and represent obstacle to the dialogue.
Thank you for your answer. As I see, we do not have any other questions, so we have come. Oh, there is one. Sorry, from Mr. Domagoj Fuk. Can you comment a bit about the 5 EU states that still don't recognize Kosovo? Do you think EU should push them to recognize Kosovo?
Yes, I do. I do think, and I think they have made a mistake for now. 13 years that they didn't do so. Why? Because they have weakened EU's capacity to influence developments in Western Balkans. They have weakened EU's capacity to stabilize and promote democracy and economic development in Western Balkans. Imagine if these 5 countries had recognized Kosovo back in 2008, not only that would have opened path for Kosovo to move forward. Not only that in turn would also ensure that Kosovo would exceed NATO, because out of those 5 EU member states, 4 are also in the NATO. So by now you would have a situation where Kosovo is a candidate status for accession into the EU, a member state in NATO, and the effect of that would be that you would have pushed Serbia to deal with real problems of Serbia. So real problems of Serbia is not Kosovo. Real problems of Serbia is the continuing deterioration of democracy in Serbia, continuing deterioration of freedom of media in Serbia. So shrinking of democratic space in Serbia to an unprecedented level. So what you would have done if you would have recognized Kosovo 13 years ago, that would have exercised pressure, democratic pressure, upon Serbia as the biggest country in the region to focus on democratic reforms, focus on regional cooperation, promote good governance, and basically be the flag bearer of Western Balkans accession to the EU, and not this troublemaker that continues to be in the region. So yeah, I think that five member states of the European Union should have recognized Kosovo. They should recognize Kosovo as soon as possible, and the European Union continues, of course, diplomatically behind the closed doors, to lobby, to push for the recognition. But I think we have now come into the position where we can't expect there will be any progress in the recognition by these 5 countries without progress in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't think that different European member states, let's say Germany, France, Netherlands, pick one, they are limited to the extent to which they can pressure 5 member states that didn't recognize Kosovo without progress in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue.
Thank you for your answer. Let me see if we have any other questions. So if we do not have any other questions, we have come to an end of our conference. Thank you, Mr. Šaša, for being with us today on this Friday afternoon. And I would like to thank all of our participants for being with us, especially all of our lecturers for their participation, and Mr. Etienne Penny for helping us to organize this conference. And for the end, I wish you all a pleasant rest of the day and hopefully a sunny weekend.
Stop recording.